In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as darkness still clung to the coast of Normandy, a German officer stood near the Atlantic Wall and looked out across the English Channel. What he saw in those moments would change his understanding of the war forever. The sea, which had always represented a defensive barrier protecting Fortress Europe, was no longer empty. Instead, it was completely filled with ships. Not dozens, not hundreds, but thousands. Later estimates would place the number at over 7,000 Allied vessels of every imaginable type. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, troop transports, landing craft, supply ships, minesweepers, stretching from horizon to horizon. For the officer watching from the coast, it felt less like an invasion and more like the arrival of an entire moving continent. For years, German commanders had believed that any Allied landing in Western Europe could be repelled. The Atlantic Wall, they were told, was impenetrable. Concrete bunkers, artillery batteries, minefields, barbed wire, and beach obstacles would smash any enemy force before it could gain a foothold. But in that moment, staring at the endless Allied armada, the illusion collapsed. No wall, no matter how thick, could stop something of this scale. The German officer had fought throughout the war. He had seen blitzkrieg in Poland, the fall of France, and a brutal fighting on the Eastern Front. He had witnessed destruction and death on a scale unimaginable before 1939. Yet nothing compared to what lay before him now. This was not a daring raid. This was not a limited offensive. This was total war, unleashed from the sea. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, the sheer size of the Allied force became even clearer. Smoke hung over the water as naval guns began firing. The sea trembled with explosions. It felt as though the ocean itself was under attack. The German officer understood immediately that this was something Germany could not match. Not now, not ever. Behind those ships stood the full industrial power of the United States and its allies. Every vessel represented factories working day and night, assembly lines stretching for miles, workers producing steel, engines, ammunition, fuel, and food in quantities Germany could no longer imagine. While German industry struggled under bombing raids and shortages, America had turned war production into an unstoppable machine. The officer thought back to earlier warnings that had been ignored. Some German planners had warned that if the United States fully mobilized, the war would become unwinnable. America was not just another enemy. It was an industrial superpower capable of replacing losses faster than Germany could inflict them. Now, that reality was floating directly toward him across the channel. As landing craft began detaching from larger transports, the invasion shifted from overwhelming to terrifying. Thousands of small boats surged toward the beaches like a living organism. Even if many were destroyed, countless more would still make it ashore. German guns opened fire, shells crashing into the water, but the waves of attackers kept coming. The officer realized that Germany was facing not just soldiers, but logistics on a scale never seen in human history. Each Allied soldier landing that day would be fed, armed, supplied, reinforced, and supported continuously. Trucks, fuel pipelines, artificial harbors, air cover, and naval gunfire would ensure the invasion did not stall. This was not a gamble. It was a calculated, overwhelming application of power. Years later, German veterans would recall this same moment with haunting clarity. Many would say that when they saw the Allied fleet, they knew the war was lost, not in months or years, but in principle. You cannot defeat an enemy who can land an army larger than yours while simultaneously fighting across the globe. The officer remembered how German propaganda had once mocked American military ability. Before the war, some Nazi leaders claimed Americans were soft, undisciplined, incapable of serious fighting. They pointed to consumer culture and Hollywood as evidence of weakness. Standing on the Normandy coast, watching wave after wave of Allied troops approach under relentless naval fire, that myth died instantly. The invasion was not just military, it was psychological. German defenders felt dwarfed, overwhelmed, and isolated. Communication lines were severed. Command structures collapsed. Officers struggled to move reserves under constant Allied air attacks. The sky itself belonged to the enemy. American, British, and Canadian aircraft filled the air from dawn to dusk, attacking roads, bridges, railways, and troop movements. The German officer realized something else that morning. This invasion had been prepared for years. Nothing about it was rushed. From deception operations that misled German intelligence to the precise timing of tides and moonlight, the Allies had planned every detail. Germany, by contrast, was reacting late and under pressure. As reports filtered in from other sectors, the picture grew even bleaker. Paratroopers had landed behind the lines. Key bridges were captured. Coastal batteries were being silenced by naval bombardment. Even where German troops fought fiercely, they were simply being bypassed or crushed by sheer numbers. The Atlantic Wall, once hailed as an engineering marvel, now seemed pitiful. Concrete bunkers designed to stop small-scale landings were being reduced by battleship shells weighing thousands of pounds. Mines and obstacles slowed the Allies, but could not stop them. For every obstacle, there were engineers trained and equipped to remove it. The officer felt a strange mixture of fear and clarity. Fear, because he understood the immediate danger. Clarity, because the truth was now undeniable. Germany could not replace what it was about to lose. The Allies could. As the beach fighting intensified, he could see columns of smoke rising inland. Allied troops were breaking through. More ships continued to arrive. The sea showed no sign of emptiness, no end to the flow of men and machines. Even if Germany somehow pushed the attackers back today, they would return tomorrow, with even more. This was not the kind of war Germany had prepared for. Blitzkrieg depended on speed, surprise, and decisive blows. D-Day represented the opposite: endurance, logistics, and overwhelming force. Against that, courage alone meant nothing. The German officer understood that history was unfolding before his eyes. Future generations would study this moment as the turning point of the war in the West, the beginning of the end. Not because German soldiers lacked bravery, but because no army in the world could withstand an enemy capable of assembling and sustaining such power. As the morning wore on, he stopped thinking in terms of victory or defeat. Instead, he thought about inevitability. The Allies were not just invading Normandy. They were reclaiming Europe step by step, mile by mile, with resources Germany could no longer counter. By midday, the beaches were firmly in Allied hands. Tanks were coming ashore. Artillery followed. Engineers built roads almost as fast as bombs destroyed them. The invasion did not slow, it accelerated. The German officer knew then that this was only the beginning. France would fall. Germany would be pushed back. The war would come home. And all of it began with one unforgettable sight: an ocean completely covered with Allied ships, stretching beyond the horizon, carrying with them the unstoppable weight of industrial war. As the first waves of Allied troops fought their way inland on the morning of June 6th, the German officer standing near the Normandy coast was no longer thinking in terms of tactics or bravery. He was thinking in numbers. The horizon behind the landing beaches was still filled with ships, and more were arriving every hour. What he had witnessed was not merely an invasion force. It was the physical manifestation of industrial power converted into military reality. German coastal commanders had prepared for an invasion, but not for this scale. For years, German planners believed that any Allied landing would be limited, risky, and vulnerable. They expected a sharp thrust that could be contained, counterattacked, and thrown back into the sea. What they saw instead was something entirely different. The invasion did not feel fragile. It felt permanent. Every German report that morning described the same thing. Endless ships, landing craft shuttling back and forth without pause. Warships firing continuously. Aircraft overhead in numbers that blotted out the sky. Even as German artillery scored occasional hits, the flow never stopped. Where one landing craft was destroyed, 5 more took its place. By midday, German officers began to understand something deeply unsettling. The Allies were not concerned with conserving resources. They were not hesitating, probing, or testing defenses. They were overwhelming them deliberately. Losses were expected, accepted, and absorbed without slowing the operation. This realization struck particularly hard for officers trained in the German way of war. The Wehrmacht had always emphasized efficiency, precision, and conservation of force. German commanders were taught to win through maneuver, surprise, and careful use of limited resources. On D-Day, they were facing an enemy who fought differently. The Allies fought as if resources were infinite. Reports sent inland described beaches that could not be cleared because fresh troops arrived faster than defenders could engage them. Ammunition shortages became immediate. Communications were disrupted by airstrikes. Reserve that might have counterattacked were pinned down by naval gunfire or destroyed by fighter bombers before they could even move. For the German officer watching from his observation point, the invasion began to resemble a natural force rather than a military operation. Like a rising tide, it advanced regardless of resistance. Every defensive position lost was not followed by a pause, but by another wave. By evening, the scale of the operation became impossible to deny. Supplies were already piling up on the beaches. Vehicles rolled ashore in long columns. Engineers were building roads, clearing obstacles, and expanding beachheads at astonishing speed. Temporary harbors were taking shape. What was meant to be a quick landing was becoming a permanent foothold. The officer realized something critical that night. Even if German forces somehow pushed the Allies back a few miles, it would not matter. The invasion could not be undone. The sheer volume of men, equipment, fuel, and ammunition meant that the Allies could absorb setbacks and continue advancing. Germany could not. In the days that followed, this understanding spread throughout the German command structure. Reports from Normandy no longer spoke of defeating the invasion, only of delaying it. Every kilometer gained by the Allies came with heavy losses, but those losses were replaced almost immediately. German losses were not. Captured Allied soldiers spoke openly about reinforcements, supply schedules, and follow-up waves. German interrogators were stunned by the confidence. These men did not speak like soldiers who feared being cut off. They spoke like workers on an assembly line, certain that the system behind them would keep moving. Air superiority made the situation even more hopeless. German movements during daylight became suicidal. Columns were destroyed before reaching the front. Fuel shortages paralyzed armored units. Even when German tanks reached the battlefield, they were often outnumbered and outmatched by Allied coordination. The officer who had watched the sea now watched the skies. Allied aircraft operated continuously, striking roads, railways, and troop concentrations. There was no safe rear area. The front line was everywhere. As weeks passed, the full implication of D-Day became undeniable. The invasion was not just about liberating France. It was about applying pressure that Germany could not escape. From the east, the Soviet armies were advancing relentlessly. From the west, the Allies were building strength at a pace Germany could not match. German factories struggled under bombing. Skilled workers were gone, replaced by forced labor. Production fell even as demand skyrocketed. Meanwhile, American factories produced vehicles, aircraft, ships, and ammunition in quantities that defied belief. The officer remembered pre-war briefings that dismissed American industrial capacity. Those assessments now seemed absurd. The invasion fleet he had seen was proof that the war had already been decided long before the first landing craft touched the beach. By late summer, Allied forces broke out of Normandy. The German defenses collapsed rapidly. Units retreated or surrendered. Fuel shortages forced abandoned vehicles to line the roads. Air attacks turned retreats into routes. The officer understood that what he had witnessed on D-Day was the moment the balance of the war became irreversible. Not because of courage alone, but because of scale. The Allies had transformed economic power into military dominance. As Paris was liberated and Allied armies surged toward Germany, the memory of that morning remained vivid. The endless ships, the constant movement, the feeling that resistance, no matter how brave, was ultimately futile. In the final months of the war, as German cities burned and front collapsed, many officers reflected on when they knew the war was lost. For some, it was Stalingrad. For others, it was the bombing of German industry. But for those who stood on the Normandy coast, it was June 6, 1944. The moment they saw 7,000 Allied ships on the horizon, they knew they were not facing an invasion. They were facing an unstoppable force.